The first session today we have is on cryptocurrencies from Valeska. She's a partner at Lowenstein, and she has a lot of experience in venture as well as in ICOs and supporting companies in their cryptocurrency initiatives. Valeska?
Hello? Okay, great. I'm going to be talking to you guys very broadly about token offerings and then more specifically about ICOs. So let's start over here. Just to do it the way I usually like to do presentations is if you guys have a question during it, just go ahead and ask because I feel like you'll forget it if we wait till the end. So feel free to raise your hand and we'll go from there. How many of you guys own Bitcoin? Aha. How many of you own Ether? How many own Ripple? Okay. So when I used to ask this question a year ago, almost nobody raised their hand. So you can see that there's been a big change. And in our slide, if you're looking at what's the definition of cryptocurrency, you'll see that it says that there's no government that has any kind of cryptocurrency that's backing it. That needs to be updated because now there's Venezuela, right? So there's been a bunch of big changes, which is kind of going to be a theme that you're going to hear, I'm sure, throughout the day. But even in the definition of like how we think about what cryptocurrency is and what we do with it, that's changed as well. So on to initial coin offerings. And I should say, like, really it's more token offerings because there's private placements and then there's public placements, and public ones we usually tend to think of as ICOs. What is it? It's basically a fundraising event. So I could just have a blockchain technology. I'm not really planning on raising any money, but I want to just send out my blockchain and I could have it so that there's tokens or not tokens. But in all these cases, there's going to be tokens and you're going to be selling these tokens. And the whole idea is I'm raising money so I can fund some type of project. So that's really what I'm doing there. So, and then I'm getting some type of consideration. So it used to be that it was almost all exclusively going to be Bitcoin or Ether, because these are almost all ERC20 tokens. And when I say almost all, that was probably true maybe like 3 months ago. In the last 3 months, I've seen a lot of Stellar lumens being used instead of Ethereum. Part of that is, from what I've heard, it's faster. And also, it's gotten really expensive to be doing things on Ethereum. So in terms of gas prices and things like that, whereas Stellar is a little bit faster, it's definitely cheaper for transactions. So it's from ad tech clients, I've heard that Stellar actually ends up being a little bit better for this type of thing. And then what are we describing as crowdsourcing? That idea is kind of in the beginning, how these things generated was there was this idea that you wanted to crowdsource a project, and tokens just lent really well to that. So people started doing it that way. And you can see like sales numbers in the 13.7 billion. It's gotten really big. So last year, around 2017, it started eclipsing what you were doing with angel rounds, which was kind of surprising people in the venture community because we weren't expecting it to be so big. What are tokens here? So this isn't going to be like a Bitcoin, or it's not going to be straight Ether. It's going to be some type of altcoin that we're selling. And usually the way it is, or at least the way it has been in the past, is you're selling some type of SaaS platform or some type of service that's software related, and you're going to be selling that with your token. So you take the token, you exchange it, and you get the service. Really, you're selling a bulk of them. So I'd be selling 1 million of my tokens, and then I'm selling them to an investor, and that investor is planning on reselling them to somebody else. But the underlying goal of this thing was, I have some type of token, and in the end, there's going to be an end user somewhere along the way, and that end user is going to be changing it in and getting some type of service. That has changed a little bit. I used to have this slide deck, and I would say there's no such thing as an equity token. People had talked about, like the DAO had famously had, like you get some type of profit or some type of dividend type thing that comes off of it. And then people kind of backed away from that after the DAO case. So, but nobody had really tried to do equity tokens. But again, in the last few months, we've seen people come out and try to do equity tokens, so much to the extent that people in the Caymans have this initiative group where they're talking about how do we do these, because a lot of them kind of get offshore to Caymans and Malta. And over there, they've started talking about equity tokens, and should they start considering those as securities, and how is that different? And so people all over the place are trying to categorize these things. If you're doing an equity token, there's a lot of chatter here about, Delaware passed some legislation that says that you can do it. Or is anybody here a lawyer, or am I the only? Okay, one. There's 2 of us here. So lawyers get really excited about what Delaware does, because every company, how many founders are out here? So you guys have formed companies. I'm sure you formed them in Delaware. Lawyers get really excited about Delaware because anything Delaware does, you're like, this is the future, because every company is formed in Delaware for the most part. I practice mainly in California. When people come to me and say, I want to form a California company, I'm like, absolutely not, go to another law firm. It's a horrible idea. Not really, but I mean, you get the idea. It's a really bad idea. So Delaware passed some legislation somewhat recently, I think it was like last year, that said you can do blockchain ledgers. And everybody said, oh, great, that means I can do my equity on that, which is not really the case. You have some things that help you for transfers of tokens and for keeping a ledger with tokens, but there's no law in Delaware that makes it really clear or easy for you to be able to do tokenized equity. So there's no country that I'm aware of that does that. People are trying to do it, and there's kind of workarounds that you can do. They're not elegant. Nobody's really tested it. We don't really know how it's going to work, but it's something that's kind of new and coming on the horizon. It started popping up around the same time people said, why don't we also start tokenizing other assets like real estate or other things? So you'll see like the concept of like what can I tokenize is really broadened. It's gotten pretty big, and it's gotten pretty interesting. I like this last point because everybody gets really excited about ICOs. And it used to be, I think sometime last year, CB Insight said it was something like half of the ICOs failed. Now it's like 2/3 of the ICOs fail. So there's a very small number. You hear about it in the press all the time. And then, a lot of the bigger ones, they raise a ton of money, but there's a lot of them that come out with very ambitious plans, and they fall pretty significantly short of that. So this is kind of more on how launches were done in the past. Previously, what you'd have, if you go back 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, all you would have is a white paper, and the white paper would have everything in it. They were pretty sparse. When I say everything in it, it was all the disclosures that they were ever planning on giving you about these tokens and what they were doing were in this white paper. So that would say, how big is the ICO going to be? How many tokens are they? What is their token allocation? Everything was in this white paper. And half the time I would read these white papers and say, I'm more confused than I was when I opened it. So we've come quite a bit from there. The concept of like token sale websites, CoinKitties, roadshows, this is how it was kind of all done a little while ago before anybody was believing or kind of getting comfortable with it being regulated. You'd have, people on social media. It was really big on Facebook, which has now been banned. Other sites where they were just advertising tokens. So if you were in the blockchain space, I'm sure you guys got lots of advertisements for buy this token, buy that token, something like that. Everybody's seen it. We've kind of moved a little bit from that. I guess we're going to have lots of Game of Thrones references. There was another one earlier. But the general idea being that like there was this concept of a utility token, and everybody said, okay, I have this utility token. And there was a few of the larger law firms that were kind of pushing this theory too, and they said, as long as you have a utility token, you're totally cool, you can sell it. And the SEC kind of put the smack down with the Dow case. So I like to say that it was kind of the Wild West. Maybe that's probably because I'm from Texas and I like those analogies. But the Dow case came out and the SEC said, yeah, that doesn't really work. So if you're going to parse through what's the Howey test, a lot of people said, well, I can go and scalp tickets, and I'm buying my tickets and I'm not buying them for use, so I think I'm going to profit it. Or there's Beanie Babies, and I was buying Beanie Babies and reselling them for profit. But if we're really looking at like what does the Howey test say, a lot of these ICOs fall pretty smack dab into it very easily. And you're looking at an investment. And initially I heard a lot of like, well, I'm not really investing because I'm not putting cash in. And that was just total baloney. If you're putting in Ether, if you're putting anything of value, even if you're giving them like a bunch of shirts, t-shirts, it doesn't matter. You're making some type of investment, some type of property. Investment is super easy to get. Now you get a common enterprise. Well, I mean, these tokens had some kind of SaaS platform behind it, right? I mean, that's your common enterprise. It's kind of hard to get around that one. Okay, well, so then we go to expectation of profits. Well, all of your investors expected to make money or they wouldn't invest. Plus, you had all these slide decks saying, this token's going to skyrocket. Today it's worth 2 cents. Tomorrow it's going to be worth $1 million. It's hard to say that you're not expecting profits. Then we get to efforts of others, and this is where people kind of glammed on the most, and they said, well, sure, we're helping, but as like the token issuer, but we also have this open source community, and we're going to have other developers doing it. They're going to be doing the SDKs. They're going to be doing all these other things. So we're doing stuff, but there's other people helping. And the SEC was very clear, just like all the cases that have been coming down for the last 100 years, it's just substantial efforts of others. So your substantial efforts. And basically all of these ICO companies, you're putting the token out there. If an investor is going to be buying it, they're expecting you to be doing something. And so that something is going to manage up to the efforts of others. So now we get to what's kind of current state of play with the SEC. So the director of CorpFin came out with a speech. If any of you guys are bored and want to fall asleep one night, great read. I actually really enjoyed it. I think it was like fairly concise, really elegant, well done. The lawyer in the room would appreciate it. Okay, yeah. But he did a good job of kind of explaining. I think people might have stretched it a little bit too far, and they said, oh, we just need to be decentralized. Everything's decentralized. But kind of his point with Ether, and one of the interesting things he said was, forget about what happened with Ether in the beginning. So we don't want to get into that because they did do an ICO type thing. But today, as Ether is today, it's really decentralized. You don't look at Ether and that substantial efforts of others. You're not expecting anybody in the Ethereum group to really be doing anything for you. What you're expecting is somebody else, some other company, to be coming up with a new app and a new altcoin and a new way to use the Ethereum platform. And that's what you're really looking for in Ether. It's really decentralized. It really is a use case at this point in time. And stuff built on that might not be, but Ethereum itself is like pretty clearly in there. So he didn't talk about Ripple, which is interesting because that's in a big lawsuit right now. He didn't talk about Stellar, but the point was just how decentralized are you? And if your two cases are Bitcoin and Ethereum, I mean, those are the most decentralized of all of them. So it's query how much that's really going to get you with any of the other ones. But it was an interesting point. What he does do are kind of the Hinman factors. And he gives like a really good list of trying to figure out why something is a security or why it isn't a security. And so there's a set for each of them. And if you kind of go through them and you're looking at it, it follows the Howey test, but it applies it very clearly to this specific technology. So if you're looking at creating and selling a digital assets whose efforts are significantly affecting value, that's all these companies that are putting a bunch of effort into making sure that their altcoin particularly is just kicking it out of the park, making a lot of money, doing well. And so when you're thinking about all these things, if you're looking at Tezos or any of the other ones that are raising a bunch of money, they're all doing this and they're all talking about that. You read the white paper, you can tell exactly how they're doing it. Motivated to keeping a stake in it. And so the stake, I think, personally could be the founders own a giant stake in it. And the founders control the company, right? Or the company retains it. And for the most part, when you have a token allocation, you're keeping some amount of it and you're kind of controlling the system for a while. And that happens to an extent until you've bled out the coins. And that's a lot of them. And then, functional network trying to enhance functionality. Basically what that is are you as an entity still trying to make this network better? Are you still improving on it? Are you still kind of like this business entity that's making this product and improving on this product? And purchasers investing, I think this is one of the most important things. If you're selling for use, if you had a typical contract that said you're going to be buying this token and you're buying it because you're buying the service and you have 20 users and your 20 users can get a year of service for this token and that's what it's redeemable for and I'm selling you 20 tokens. Or you want some overage, I'm giving you 25 in case you grow. That makes sense for use cases. When I say I'm selling you 1 million tokens, you don't have any users and you're just doing it for profit, again, it's pretty clear. Like when you actually go through these, they do make a lot of sense. And here's on the flip side of that, here's things that are less like a security where you're not really dealing with speculation. You really are doing this for use. People are using this product, and that will happen kind of in the back end. But in the beginning, when you're doing this ICO, these factors just really don't apply. They're just not stuff that you're doing. Early stage versus fully functioning. If you go to the last one, that's kind of a big part of the reason why they don't hit this. I can't really have a use. It's hard to price it. It's hard to know what I'm really going to do. For the most part, most of these are just saying, I'm going to be creating some type of token. I don't really know what it's going to be doing. I have some sense of it. I have some idea of what I want to do. You're funding my project. So it's so early stage, it's even hard to kind of tell what the use is going to be and how that's going to play out in the market. So just to step back, that was a lot of like what the US SEC is doing. You also have to think about states. Each of the 50 states can regulate securities all by their little lonesome, and they don't have to be consistent with each other. They can do kind of whatever they want, and states actually have some of them have a very broad definition, even broader than what the SEC has of what is a security. So it's kind of roping you in a couple of places. Just to list out a couple of places where people have gone crazy in all the plaintiffs' lawsuits. It's one thing to get in trouble with the SEC. They're really going to go after like low-hanging fruit and big guys. But where a lot of people have been running into, it's not like you've seen, the SEC sent a bunch of subpoenas, which is a little unusual. But where we've really heard a lot of the rumble is plaintiffs' lawyers suing, saying, you violated the securities laws, this token went down in value, I want my money back. And so that's where you get like the Tezos and the Ripple lawsuits. So just to go through, I used to hear a lot of, and I still do, the SEC is really crazy. I don't understand all these states. I don't really know what to do. I just want to do my token offering abroad. So I'm going to cut the US out entirely, which means you don't have to worry about the SEC. You don't have to worry about a Howey test. You don't have to worry about what you're doing at all with the states. What you do have to worry about is every other country you're selling into. And this is from, this shows kind of a progression in 2017. But you'll see like it moves towards, for the most part, people aren't banning them, but just about everybody is regulating them. So you'll see that countries have different ways of doing regulations. But even if you're looking at like common jurisdictions where people are basing and selling these tokens, the ones that I see the most commonly are probably Caymans. Malta's starting to crop up a little bit more. All of them are regulated. Caymans is starting to get regulated. They're supposed to come out with guidance in the next few weeks, which they've been saying for a while. But you'll see there's just a ton of countries that are really starting to regulate this. So I think Hong Kong is still pretty mild in that. It's a lot easier to sell in Hong Kong, I think, than some other places. But everybody kind of has rules. So as you're going in and selling into each of these jurisdictions, you really need to look out and say, I need to reach out to local counsel. I need to figure out what's going on. It's a process to sell these tokens into anywhere. So, and that's a little bit different from what you're used to doing when you just go in and like sell a product. Usually you would think, well, maybe I'm hiring some employees. I need an employment lawyer locally, or maybe I can kind of just do consultants and ignore it for a while. So normally when you go into a market, you're worried about what are the taxes, what are the employment issues. Now you have to worry about what are the securities issues, even if you're not selling stock options to these guys over there. So it's kind of just added another thing on your checklist of if I'm doing business in another country and I'm selling tokens over there, or my tokens get over there, do I need to be worried about anything? So, and this just kind of tracks what kind of government regulation has been going on recently, how's it moved. It's changed quite a bit, and I think it's all moved more towards more regulation. So there's the primary issuance where I go out as a company and I'm selling these things, I'm raising an ICO, and then there's also the concept of, okay, now everybody that bought from me owns a token and they want to sell, but that's also regulated, unfortunately. So if you're connecting those people, the buyer and sellers, you're probably a broker. If you're a broker, you have to be registered with the SEC. If you're an electronic exchange, you also have to be registered. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So what we're talking about generally is if you're doing it on an electronic exchange, you have to be a broker-dealer too, and there's a common exemption for alternative trading systems, or ATSs. And so for ATSs, you're registered with the SEC. You're also registered with FINRA. And we actually have a broker-dealer partner who spends a lot of time talking with both organizations trying to get a couple of these up and registered. For normal ATSs, there's a pretty streamlined process. They've been bumping into a lot of problems with custody. And for custody, that's normally it's, who owns the account, who are you? But how do you do that with a wallet in a good way? And accounting firms are actually bumping up against this too, where, they're trying to do an audit and they don't really, it's just hard to prove custody in a good way. Yeah. So if you've heard a lot about like KYC, know your customer, AML, anti-money laundering, things like making sure you're not selling to arms traders or, people in banned countries, OFAC regulations, it's harder to, so for a security, a typical security, if I'm just selling you Series A stock, all I do is check who you are. I know you're not on a banned countries list. I know, or you're not on like you're not on a list as an arms trader or a terrorist or something. It's pretty straightforward. And also people just aren't as worried about it because it's not as rampant, right? You're going to have to go and send a wire transfer from a bank that knows you, that did KYC. It's going to go into an account for somebody that knows you. Everything is kind of on a known system. In crypto, it's a little bit less like that. Your wallet, you could have 10 people owning one wallet. You could have one person owning 20 wallets. And the people can transfer wallets. All I have to do is move my private key from me to you. So how do I prove KYC and AML and OFAC stuff to the same extent and prove that you really have custody over this wallet and you'll retain custody over this wallet? And it's a lot harder in crypto. And so ATSs and banks and all these regulatory authorities are really struggling with this problem, and that's what's causing a lot of hiccups. So one of the main kind of repercussions of that is you have a bunch of these entities that really want to be, ATSs really want to be trading platforms, but there just isn't a streamlined way of doing this, and people haven't really worked it out. So there's a lot of active efforts. If you heard about T0 and Templum, and their ATSs that have been trying for quite some time. I think Coinbase just bought one. They bought an ATS. I don't think it was a little. But nobody's like actively trading on this right now, and that might change in the next few months. But they're kind of struggling with it. It's a little bit hard to deal with. What that really means, though, is once you buy these tokens, you can trade them to somebody you know. You can hire a broker, and there's not very many brokers that are really actively working in this space. It's kind of pumping up, but there's no platform in the U.S. where you can legally trade these securities, and that really stifles trading here. So I think more so than the regulations where you could actually just comply. There's no workaround right now for how to do secondary trading, and that really hurts your market. You can go to Japan and they have regulated exchanges, but here we don't. And so I think that's a huge problem. So to move away from and just talk about, since we don't have very many lawyers, I'll talk about this more broadly. But the way you would normally do these fundraisings, if you're doing a private one, the way you would do like a Series A financing or a seed financing is pretty much the same way you do private placements here. The general idea is you're going to be selling to accredited investors. They're unlimited. It's under 506, but you're checking to make sure they're accredited. A few years ago, they changed the rules and they allowed you to do general solicitation. It used to be that there was no general solicitation if you were doing a private placement offering. Now there's this concept of like 506B and 506C, but the general thing of it is that now you can do general solicitation. But what you have to do is you have to go through additional steps and really make sure that somebody is an accredited investor. So there's a couple things you can do where the SEC has laid out some guidance, but the general idea is you get a CPA or somebody that really knows it, they go through actual records, and they do actually verify that the person is an accredited investor. And that allows you to do the things like going out and promoting this, going to pitches, going to other places and saying, hey, we have these tokens, they're really awesome, check them out. The only time, at least when you're doing a US thing where you're worried about how am I advertising and I'm doing a 506C thing, is if I'm doing a concurrent foreign placement and I really want to bifurcate them. Then you need to talk to your attorneys. You're going to be cut back significantly. It's basically not even worth doing the 506C because there's this whole concept of direct selling efforts, and you can't do direct selling efforts if you're doing a foreign placement. And the foreign placements, if you can sell into jurisdictions where they don't have any restrictions, it's really helpful to be able to do that. We can go into that later, but in general, you get a lot of leeway. You have to have some type of token issuance document. In the past, people had SAFs, and that was kind of this idea that you have this instrument, and that instrument's a security, but the underlying token isn't a security. And that's been disproven. The SEC has been pretty clear that the token could still be a security, even if it's, you're selling it under some type of instrument. But the idea is you're selling it under some type of instrument. Usually they're prepaid forward contracts. That's more of a tax thing. But we call them warrants, whatever you want to call them. There's something where you're selling it, you're selling something today, and sometime in the future you're going to be getting these tokens. So there's been a lot of chatter about doing Reg A pluses. And that does make a lot of sense. It only works for US or Canadian issuers. There's 2 different tiers of it. Tier 2 is kind of the one that most people do because they're usually raising a fair amount of money. Tier 1's capped at 20 million. So tier 2, if you look at it, it's 50 million. That's pretty good. The secondary sales thing is kind of interesting. It's capped at 30% for the first year. So what that means is if I'm an issuer and I sell you guys all 1 million tokens, I can register the 1 million tokens as long as it's 30% of my registration for future tokens. So what you're really looking at there is, can I register the sales that I did in the private sale? And that's kind of a concept that'd be really familiar for venture attorneys. And for venture capitalists who say, I want my registration rights, if you're going to be registering, I want to jump along. Usually they're cut out of the IPO, but subsequent S1s, they're jumping in and they're doing it. There's less of a structure around that. People haven't really thought about governance so much in these companies. They probably should. We suggest that they do, but it's not mature enough of a market for it really to have evolved to that state yet. Testing the waters is basically, I don't know, have any of you taken a company public? Do you remember like the pain of gun jumping rules and all that type of stuff? This is way more lenient. So for those of you who haven't, you have to really pay a lot of attention to what you say and don't say and what kind of hype you do around the time you're doing a public offering. And so you're talking to counsel all the time. Everything goes through press reviews. Here, you probably should still be doing that with respect to things because you want to make sure that what you have is like 10b5 compliant. In other words, like no material misstatements or omissions. But you can go out and you can do testing the waters or like sending these materials out, still talking about your offering, and it's a lot broader than what you can do in like a typical standard public company context, which is really nice. That gives you a lot of wiggle room. This last part is, I think it's really important, is that Tier 2 exempts you from state requirements in theory. So that's great because otherwise you have to go to every single state, which is kind of one of the drawbacks about Tier 1. Even if you were at the point where you're like, hey, I'm selling 20 million or below, you might still want to consider a Tier 2 because then you have to go through every single state, which would be a pain. So here's just another thing about more restrictions. If I'm selling to unaccredited investors, I can do that under Tier 2. And just as a backup, I'm not sure I said this before, but the big benefit of Reg A is I sell on Reg A, and then secondary sales are freely tradable. So that means I sell it to you, you guys can sell it amongst each other, nobody cares. We're fine because it's an exemption, but it allows secondary transactions, whereas your typical private placement does not. These are just some kind of income restrictions for unaccrediteds. This is what you have to do in terms of like financial statements that you have to put up there, but the basic idea is, every 6 months as opposed to every quarter, you're doing financial statements. So Tier 2 does put a burden on you. The biggest burden in my mind is not what you do to do the filing, but is more kind of, you're sort of a quasi-public company because now you have ongoing reporting obligations. You don't under Tier 1, but you do under Tier 2, and they're nothing to sneeze at. It is lighter than what you would have if you were doing like a typical IPO, but it's still fairly significant. So instead of quarterly, you have every 6 months. You're still going to have an SEC team that knows how to do reporting, people that know how to put these statements together. It's somewhat intense. Back to crowdfunding, this is kind of another avenue that people have used to raise money in these token sales. I think it's a horrible idea, and I primarily say that because the limit's so low. You're still doing an SEC filing. It's not reviewed. There's no ongoing reporting obligations, but you're stuck at $1.07 million. It's just, by the time you've paid for attorney's fees, you've paid for the crowdfunding portal that you have to have it on, I just don't see how it really makes any sense, especially for an operating business. It just seems like too low, and that's in a 12-month period. To go back to Regulation S, this is an exemption from the SEC for sales abroad. So this is kind of what you use if you're selling outside the U.S. And in general, You get a lot of flexibility if you're selling outside the US. But if you're a domestic issuer, you have to make sure that those securities, and the onus is on you, don't bleed back into the US. In other words, that if I sell them to somebody in Hong Kong, where there's a great market and they trade really well, they don't come back to a US buyer. And that's really hard to do. Some of it's the custody stuff. But really, I can put a platform together and geofence it so I only sell to people in certain jurisdictions. And I can do KYC AML on them. But once it's out in the secondary market, it's really hard to prove that it didn't come back. So a lot of times, either you're kind of dealing with some type of technological solution that's going to slow down the trading, haven't really been proven out. There's a couple of them that are kind of working on it. Or you just have to block it and say, I'm going to sell this into a foreign market, but it's just going to be locked down and nobody can trade it for a year. And that's pretty hard to sell foreign-wise. And so a lot of times that's why people will cut out the US entirely, move abroad, and say, forget it, I'm just getting rid of this whole regime. I don't know how to make sure it's not going to flow back, and my foreign buyers aren't going to deal with a one-year lockup. So I'm going to go to Malta or Caymans or Hong Kong or Japan. I'm going to sell over there, and I'll just deal with the US when I get big enough. This is kind of like a technical problem. Does anybody remember when Facebook was kind of forced to go public because they had too many stockholders? Okay, that's a 12G problem. It's totally random. And these numbers have been increased, but the general idea is if you get big enough, then you have to register to go public, which kind of sucks because you're not really planning on doing it. You haven't really ramped up for it, but you have enough holders where you just have to. That's just part of the SEC rules. Back when Facebook had the problem, those numbers were a lot smaller. Yeah, they've been raised, and it was hard. That was a lot of the reason for transfer restrictions back in the day. Now, for the most part, with most typical companies, I'm like, oh, don't worry about it. It's never going to happen. It's so far away. And for the 500 unaccredited, you get to pull everybody that got stock out of your employee incentive pool out of that number. So that, it's pretty low. I mean, how often are they selling to unaccrediteds? So these numbers are high for that. For wallets, though, how do you do it, right? I mean, because again, you could have one wallet held by 20 people. And are those 20 people unaccredited people? You could have 10 people that hold one wallet. So I don't really know how to prove this. So basically what I'd kind of have to assume is every wallet is one holder. And then if I did my KYC AML, which you really should be doing for all of these, I would know kind of whether they were accredited or unaccredited. Once they start selling and I can do fractional tokens and things like that, you can imagine it's just so easy to blow this number out of the water. Reg A does do a conditional exemption for you, but I don't know how much it helps because even if you can fall below the public float numbers and the revenue numbers and all that, I have no idea how you do a register. I just don't know how you would be a stock register for this type of company. It doesn't really work. It's kind of ineffective. So it's a question. Taxes are a big thing. People sell equity and they don't get tax bill. If I sold $1 million of Series A stock, I get $1 million. If I sell $1 million of tokens in the US, I get a tax bill like I sold sunglasses or hats or something. And that really surprises people. There's ways of kind of delaying it and deferring it. Prepaid contracts help with that. But the IRS might not. They've never said they agree with that treatment, but the idea is I sell you the tokens today, I get the money today. When I distribute the tokens, that's when I should actually have the hit, and that's when I should be paying taxes. But the IRS might just say, never mind, we don't agree with that. And kind of this last point is, if you're actually planning on doing this, you're going to have to go to, and you want to do tax planning, you're really going to one of the big international firms like Deloitte, E&Y, PwC, one of those guys, and because they have a big enough breadth where they can tell you, this is the right country for you to be in, here's what your structure should be, and that all has to be done before you really start putting a lot of value into this, because once you have value, then you have taxes on transfer. Cyber risks and threats, this is sort of more of a, this area has kind of exploded recently. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about who's been hacked and how big they are. The numbers are really impressive there. So just looking at what happened since 2011 with the 56 Heights, just the first half of 2018 is mind-blowing how big those numbers are. So it's a real threat. It also causes real fluctuations in the currencies, so it's affecting the market. It's a big deal. So I think that is the end of mine. Did anybody have any questions? I'll get you in the back first. So people have filed Reg A pluses, and actually some people have filed S1s. Nobody has been qualified yet. So they're working on it, but our clients that are working on them right now, I tell them not to put too much effort into it until if they plan on exchanges. If they plan on, if like their primary purpose is secondary trading, because there's no exchange to support it. So you spend all this money and then there's nothing you can do with it. So you can file it confidentially if you want to kind of get ahead of the curve, and then keep it in confidential submissions, get some comments and feedback back from the SEC and work through the process. But if you're actually going out, you have to publicly file before you go out. And in that case, everybody knows what's going on. Maybe you can sell the tokens, but there's no real secondary platform, and a lot of the investors really want that secondary platform. And
yeah, I have a question about sort of the classification of a token based on utility versus security that you had. Sorry to make you go back
no, go ahead.
15 slides, but one of them was relevant to, is there activity that they're taking on that's potentially increasing the value of the network and the token? Would something like Ether, hosting hackathons, or maybe Civic's a better example, none of them are still here, but contributing to hackathons or trying to get decentralized apps to include their identity protocol, or supporting other activities that arguably are increasing the value of their network. Is that something that can draw the line between utility and security as well?
So it's something that goes to the factors, right? But none of those factors are necessarily determinative. It's kind of you look at the whole picture and figure out what makes sense. So if you're doing activities that kind of, you raised a bunch of funds, and then you're taking those funds and you're using them to like prop up the value, whether that be through, putting on hackathon events or whatever activities you're doing, if those activities are primarily there to kind of increase the value or the importance of that network and that coin, for the adoption of the coin, then it goes towards that factor that you were looking at. But in terms of like utility versus security, I was talking about like it could be based on an equity instrument. That'd be more like an equity token. Utilities, like those SaaS-based tokens where you can exchange them for services or some type of product, that's a utility token. But both of those could be securities. So I could have a utility token that is a security. So security token just means it's regulated by the government. Yes? I'd be guessing. I mean, he picked the easiest case, right? I mean, Ethereum is pretty close to, Bitcoin and Ethereum are the most decentralized of the chains. So, it definitely wasn't 1 or 2 nodes. Was it 1,000 nodes? I don't know. I don't know that it's dead. I think the former practice of ICOs is dead, where you just assume there's no regulation and you do whatever you want. The SEC sent so many subpoenas. Other governments are reacting. It's not like you can just leave the U.S. and be okay. And it's so expensive to be doing these international offerings because you're engaging counsel in all these different locations. You have advertising and marketing teams in all these different locations, which you guys, I'm sure, are familiar with. But it's difficult to sell. Investors have different expectations in all these places. The pitch decks look different. They want different terms. You kind of have to gauge the market everywhere you're selling. And so it's hard, it's expensive, and it just doesn't sell as easily. But in terms of are utility tokens themselves dead? That isn't a security. So I think the idea of a utility token not being a security for U.S. security law purposes, there's basically none. No, I agree with that. Just because it doesn't make sense. Why would you're going to sell it to investors, you're funding a project, you're going to be pumping it up, you're going to be helping to increase the value of it, you're going to be developing it. So it's going to be a security. But I think people will start complying, and people have started complying, and it will just change. It'll just be another way of fundraising for a company.
Yeah, I just have a vernacular question, actually. You
Yeah, I've definitely heard security token offerings. I think people still understand ICOs better. I could retitle it security token offering. I think ICO is more fun to put on the top of the slide deck is really the answer. Yeah.
I have a question about this last point on token valuations. Are there a set of indicators of token valuation? Is it network traffic, number of wallets, target price?
So how is a token valued kind of depends on who you're going to and what you're doing with it. So there's a concept of token valuations for if I'm going to be issuing tokens to my employees. It's kind of the same thing like I'm going to be issuing stock to my employees. I have a stock plan. So I do it under some securities rule called 701. I'm going to do the exact same thing for my equity tokens. And for that, I need a valuation, right? Because the IRS needs you to fall under a safe harbor. You have your 409A rules, all that kind of fun stuff. So that is going to fall under a token valuation that I need from a third-party vendor. So for that, I'm going to go to somebody and get a valuation from them. There's like, I'm blanking on the name of the company that does it. They're unlike the typical 409A valuations you do. There's a few vendors that do it. It's not the same vendors. They're also, from the ones I've seen, only good for 7 days. So you have to have all your token documents and all your grants ready to go. Otherwise, you're going to be paying another $10,000. Or lately, when they first came out, they were around $5,000. Then they were $10,000. The last one I got quoted was 15, and I told the client to go back and ask for 10 because that was ridiculous, and they got 12.5. But they've been increasing. There's not very many places that do it. That's one type of valuation. Then some people, depending on the token, will go to like one of the exchanges operating offshores and use that for something. There's various ways to value the token. When you're talking about something here like Ether dropping when Kraken is under cyber attack, you're looking at one of those offshore platforms. Was that your question? Okay. Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you. I appreciated your guys' time.